Do you remember when simply turning on the TV felt like stepping into another world? There was a time when movies didn't rush you. They invited you in slowly, like a sunset over the prairie. In the golden age of Hollywood's classic cinema, the mid-20th century, Western films were as calm as they were grand. They took their time showing a lone rider against the horizon or a dusty town waking up, and the story unfolded at a human pace. One observer noted that these old westerns depict a world raw and untamed and focus on the grit of one man or woman surviving in that wilderness. If you grew up watching those old movies, you know each opening scene felt like settling into an old friend's porch, patient, familiar, and gentle. Even film historians agree the Western genre was built around broad, simple themes. They point out that these Western films encapsulated themes of individualism, justice, morality, and survival set against those vast landscapes. In other words, the stories connected to values people care about, not just empty action. Those early films weren't about dazzling the audience with tricks. They were about showing people and choices against a big sky. By the time that era ended, something about the movie business had quietly shifted on the horizon.
The heroes in old westerns were straightforward. You usually knew who was good and who was bad, and the story often revolved around clear moral choices. In fact, scholars say the mythic West on screen represented freedom, open spaces, self-reliance, and the possibilities of a fresh start. And it offered heroes with bravery and integrity in a clear moral narrative. That meant every decision, every standoff felt significant. One fan of classic westerns pointed out that this simplicity peels away modern noise to focus on basic human qualities like courage and moral clarity, so that every choice has consequence and each duel takes on the proportions of a struggle for the human soul. Those movies showed survival and honor in the wild, values that resonated with audiences. By contrast, today's blockbusters can feel more tangled and loud. Remembering the old westerns can feel reassuring simply because they are so different. In fact, one film arguer that older movies often seem better because of how they contrast with today's works. He notes that modern scripts have become so formulaic that older films stand out by comparison. In those classic westerns, storytellers didn't have a formula to follow. They followed the landscape and the characters. It's like reading a well-worn book whose pages you know by heart. They weren't flashy, and that's exactly what gave them heart. And that's where things quietly changed. Step back and look at a screen in an old western. What do you see? Expansive desert, high canyon walls, endless sky. These films often used very wide shots to remind you how big the world was. One write-up calls this the Western's visual signature, expansive landscapes that evoke both freedom and loneliness. The camera would let scenes unfold, a dust cloud lingering after a galloping horse, or the sun rising slowly over the mountains. These long, slow takes gave space for emotion to grow. In fact, film researchers have found that drama films, much like classic westerns, rely on longer, drawn-out takes to maximize emotional impact, with the fewest number of edits. It meant you could sit with the hero in silence, almost hearing the wind and feel the tension build without a single cut. Compare that to today's editing style. Studies of modern cinema note that films now emphasize faster pacing and cuts to maintain engagement. That's not a bad thing for some stories, but it is very different from a western that lets you breathe. In an old movie, you would see the cowboy ride out for minutes. In a new movie, a chase scene might skip cuts every second. With westerns, a character could be quiet, thinking, and the audience had time to think too. This slower style built a calm tension. There were also fewer distractions. No flashy special effects or split-second pop-ups, just authentic stunts and real horses or hand-painted backdrops. It felt tangible. As one critic put it, modern films often pack in thousands of digital shots, and some fear filmmakers have become over-dependent on visual effects rather than focusing on the characters and story. In those old westerns, everything you saw was real or practical, and it grounded you in the story. All of this gave classic westerns a gentle rhythm. You might not notice it consciously, but the pace was human. Little by little, as audiences watched more and more new movies, that rhythm began to fade. What happened after that golden age? Movies changed. By the late 20th and early 21st century, Hollywood was in the business of spectacle. Action films accelerated. One study of modern movies notes that nowadays, filmmakers cut shots faster and faster to keep attention. Scenes that used to run a minute now flash by in 10 seconds. Explosions and CGI creatures replaced quiet campfire scenes. Even Western-style stories became darker and more complicated, or rare. Audiences also changed. We got smartphones, streaming, and shorter attention spans. Movies started racing to show everything quickly in case viewers looked away. One analysis reports that as streaming took over, movies felt pressured to be fast and flashy. All of this meant that old westerns could feel almost educational in comparison. There was no rush to advertise the next sequel, no endless explosions, just story. Some fans put it plainly, they grew up loving westerns, then noticed nothing like them in theaters anymore. They asked, where did that go? For many, the answer is, it didn't really vanish. It evolved quietly. Today, you see Western ideas reappear, maybe in a sci-fi frontier or a video game, but often with a twist. Shows like Breaking Bad or The Mandalorian borrow the lone hero motif and tough choices, but they pace things differently. In fact, reviews point out that after that mid-century era, Western tropes persisted and evolved, sometimes with moral ambiguity instead of clear heroes. The point is, Hollywood shifted gears. This might make you wonder, was it nostalgia making those old westerns feel better, or something deeper? If you grew up with them, you probably sensed that something changed in how stories were told. Maybe it's both. We can ask, do we miss those slower stories because they were simply familiar, or because fast stories leave a bit of emptiness? The answer lies somewhere between. In any case, the trail doesn't end here. In the end, despite all the changes on screen, those old Western stories still belong to us. Their lessons about honor, bravery, and freedom haven't disappeared. As one commentator put it, the frontier may have moved, but the themes of Westerns, honor, justice, and individualism, remain central to our collective storytelling. In other words, those ideals live on, even if the setting has shifted. When we watch a classic Western today, we're connecting with values that still matter, standing up for what's right, looking out for your neighbors, finding hope in a harsh world. If you remember those porch-light evenings with a cowboy on screen, you're not alone. There are many who grew up in that era and still feel that quiet draw. These stories became part of our culture and even our identities. No matter how modern films evolve, the old Westerns taught us to ride patiently toward the horizon. They let us feel that wide-open freedom, and they let us sit quietly and think about what really matters. If you remember this era, you're not alone. These stories still matter, just as much as ever.